consultant. I head a consulting company, South Asia operations, and we are fairly involved in the smart grids developments in India because we are working on a project where we are supporting the Indian Smart Grids Task Force in deploying smart grids. So as you are well aware, and I'm sure we are going to touch upon that in the course of time, that there are 14 pilots which are being planned, and these cover a range of aspects including demand response. And of course there is life beyond those 14 pilots in smart grids, and hopefully we are going to see a lot of developments. So we are very closely involved in this process because of our work with the ISGTF. But beyond the ISGTF work, we are involved in a couple of pilots, one of which is on demand response, and it integrates actually demand response with renewable energy integration. So this is in Tamil Nadu, and in a high wind belt. It's also a high industrial belt, and there's a, as you would be aware, southern region has major constraints of supply, or used to have major constraints of supply till very recently. So customers would get cut off either by roster or by, suddenly, depending on what would be the grid conditions. So in those circumstances, all they had as option is to either run diesel generation or back down load. The whole point of having participation of customers in this process is that they would be able to plan better, and that's better for the economy. If they're not burning diesel, these customers or these industries would be more competitive, and at the end of the day they would have control over their destiny, and at the same time benefiting the grid. I mean, in a manner of speaking, we have always been practicing demand response in the country, except that it's involuntary, that you just cut off the customer, so which is not something anywhere else in the world that happens. But hopefully we are going to get to a time where it's more voluntary, more participative, the customers coming in, and I think that's the whole discussion today. Just one couple of words before we get into the core of demand response, and this is kind of unrelated to demand response, but still a very important development which we must take note of, because that sets the environment for demand response. The first thing is we must remember is that in the wholesale level, markets are working. And because markets work, people in different parts of the country have the ability to procure or sell depending on what is the signal they're getting from the market. This is something which is happening, as a consequence of which we are seeing substantial flattening of the load curve, which in some sense is the purpose of demand response. The second thing which is happening is that transmission integration is becoming stronger and stronger, which means that what had to be achieved locally can now be achieved also partly at a more wider scale, at a state level, at a national level, regional level, or national level. So these are very important developments. So when we look at the benefits of demand response and we look at what to expect from demand response, we must keep this context in mind, that similar outcomes are being achieved through alternate means as well. So our expectations from demand response, which is a more complicated process, should be rational and reasonable. The final thing which is important to note is that if you look at the power market prices, which I'm sure you do, you will see that the differences between peak power and off-peak power prices have become very limited, because what has happened is that in our supply expansion planning, we did not really budget for the fact that our intensity of energy consumption would be going down, and because of markets and transmission, our load curve automatically would get much more flatter. So we built the wrong kind of capacity. We have built now a lot of base load capacity. In that context, when we go down in the future, demand response will offer the peaking capacity in the system and the flexible capacity in the system. So we need to work on that. But again, as I said, keep the rational expectation rational. So we should not talk about it as a mantra, but more look at the overall context in which demand response would operate, and get to some very analytically quantified targets and objectives for demand response. That's my opener. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Vikram?
Good morning, everybody. My name is Vikram Gandotra, and I head strategy and marketing for energy automation in Siemens. I've been with this organization for 26 plus years. Uh, and besides that, I have a lot of interest in doing things with getting involved with subjects which are more with pertinent to what our future will hold in the power sector. So in that capacity, I have been working with India Smart Grid Forum. I am a board of governor member and head one working group for load control and consumption. And what really made me accept immediately the offer from Bridgit was that I enjoy working with the young minds. So I'm very happy to be in the middle of so many bright sparks, and would really enjoy some really good, meaningful question answer. And coming to the topic of demand response, yes, it is a very, very interesting, very futuristic approach. It happens in certain parts of the country, parts of the world already. And in India, of course, we are forced to do demand response, because whatever we produce, it is still less in terms of power for most of the day. Of course, in the night, we have always a surplus. But coming to the future, once we come to a stage where most of our population is able to access reliable power supply and enjoy the benefits and increase that load, we will definitely come to a stage where demand response will be a very critical tool for the DISCOMs to manage their networks and also pass on the benefits to the end consumer. Yeah. So I think we can take up some issues later. So this was an introduction. So I pass Dr. Bhai.
Thanks, Bridgit, and thanks, Great Lakes Academy. I'm coming from IBM. I have been working in power sector for the past nearly 25 years, and prior to joining IBM as part of Siemens, I was working with Vikram actually. IBM is very active in the smart grid area all over the world, associated with more than 100 smart grid projects across the world. And we have been exploring different aspects of smart grid. IBM research is working extensively on various components of smart grid, which includes peak load management, which includes demand response. And there are certain aspects of demand response, for example, customer outreach, customer awareness. That is also one of the focus area for IBM. In terms of specific projects that we have been doing, I mean, there are quite a few pilot projects we have done in US. And in India also, in one of the utilities, we are working with them for the demand response project. That it's basically a pilot project that is going on, and we are working closely with that utility in India. So some of the aspects Anish has very brilliantly put those some of the points on demand response, and I totally agree with that. One of the thing is that, for example, there is already involuntary demand response that is happening by way of load shedding. And this is one of the important aspect of any demand response scheme that is to succeed in India. Because if so long as the DISCOMs have the option of cutting down the load by simply load shedding, then the success of demand response program in India would be definitely going to be a question mark. There are other aspects. I mean, demand response is fine. You have to talk to the clients. You have to talk to the customers so that they manage their loads. You have to interact with them and etc. and come out with some kind of schemes and etc. But we need to have regulatory backup for this, which at the moment probably is not there. The market needs to be also modified. At the moment, it is only UI charges, and that is a kind of market mechanism that we have. We need to develop the ancillary markets, and we need to work out different ways and different schemes for the market integration. And I think these are the few points which definitely need to be addressed if the demand response has to become a success in India. I mean, it is not just managing the loads. There is an entire gamut of different aspects that we need to address, and it starts at the customer premise, but it also has a lot of implications in terms of regulatory changes, in terms of market changes, and I think these also need to be addressed. Thanks a lot.
Gopal.
Good morning. My name is Gopal Saxena. I am heading BSES Rajdhani Power Limited, which is by far the largest distribution licensee operating in Delhi and possibly on a single entity basis in the private sector anywhere in India. I'm delighted to be able to talk to you, share some of my thoughts, some of my perspectives, and the way forward with respect to the entire power market in India and possibly in many parts of the world. BSES Rajdhani Limited is at the forefront of technological process and IT innovation in India certainly, and possibly in many parts of the world, even though it's not so universally recognized. And some of the initiatives that we have taken with respect to the merger of communications, IT, and feedback mechanisms are now possibly being recognized in many parts of India today. If one looks at the power sector, I think there are three basic premises that govern the growth of this sector. The first part of it is access to all those who do not have power. The second part is availability, in the sense that all those that do have power should have power for 24 hours. And the third part is affordability, in the sense that can you really afford the access or the availability of power, and if so, what are you prepared to pay for it? I also serve on the Smart Grid Task Force, the Government of India, and one of the subsects of that is access of power to rural markets and reliability of power to urban areas. And in that context, I think there are several challenges that face all of us, particularly in view of the fact that 40% of India still goes without electricity. As most of you would know, I think today a smartphone, internet, social media, very much a part of your lives. Can anyone who does not have a smartphone raise their hands now? You see. Now imagine in the last 10 years, smartphones have become an aspect of life that we are all so familiar with. Now, how many of you do not have a Facebook account? One. Okay. So the other point that is very important to note, particularly in this journey towards a smart grid, is this aspect of communication and convergence. 15 years back, there was hardly any internet, and today you're talking of being able to communicate all over the world. And that communication opens up the possibility to not only communicate, but the possibility to govern, to modify, or to influence behavior in a certain manner. And that is extremely important in the power sector, where, as Anish talked about, how do you look at movement of power, transport of power across a wide range of medium, from the central transmission utilities to the state transmission utilities and back to the distribution sector. I'll just take 2 minutes more to highlight a couple of issues. One of the issues that's constantly being raised is this aspect of peak load shortages, energy shortages, peak energy shortages. it's my personal feeling that all that is a myth. It's just that we can't afford it. I'll give you one of the reasons why. The overall capacity, generation capacity in India is 230,000 megawatts as at present. On the other hand, the total peak load that has been used in India or carried by the grid is just 130,000 megawatts, which means that 100,000 megawatts is something which does not come into the reckoning when it comes to usage. The second part, when this peak load of 130,000 megawatts was ascertained, there was still 30,000 megawatts of base load generation that had been backed off, which meant that those plants were not producing. Anish had raised this issue that there is a whole lot of misalignment of generation. But the fact remains that if one were to operate all our coal sector plants which are normally construed as base load generation, we would have enough power available to feed the peak load even today. 230,000 megawatts, 65% of 230,000 megawatts is about 140,000 megawatts. 85% plant load factor, you'd still come to 120,000 megawatts of availability. But the fact is that the states do not have the money to be able to procure that power. Students of economics would easily understand this phenomenon. Whenever one looks at price elasticity and price inelasticity, what is the price elastic demand and what is the price inelastic demand? And then one comes across a scenario where in Gurgaon, where you are based, people are willing to buy power at 18 rupees, 16 rupees. But when it comes to the state electricity board and the tariff that is there, the state electricity board is not able to raise the base load tariff from 3 rupees 40 paise to 5 rupees even. I think I'll take questions as we go along, but I'll leave. Chintan has done excellent work on smart grid, so I'm sure Chintan will give a great perspective on this. Thank you.
Gopal.
So, my name is Chintan Soni, and I run this company called Ecolibrium Energie, based out of Ahmedabad. In fact, we hired 3 students, thanks to Hari sitting there, last year. We're a very young organization, and everyone sitting on the panel, they are very senior to me. But I'll bring out a perspective from what we've learned in the last 3 years. Us as an organization, we started looking at demand response 3 years back, saying that we want to be the largest virtual power plant of the country. Didn't know that we were going to have tough times ahead. We are still talking about whether demand response should be done or not, and 3 years back we said we'll be the biggest. So we're surviving because when we went out in the market, we realized that while demand response is a great concept, it works everywhere in the world, India has its own challenges. Before that, what needs to be done is for consumers to understand what their consumption is. And that's where the communication part plays a large role. I always draw this parallel between telecom and electricity. 10, 15 years back, we used to pick up the phone and say, I want this number. The operator would pick it up and then connect, and you would have a trunk call or maybe 15, 20 years back. India right now is the largest prepaid market in the world. when it comes to mobile phones. And this shows the attitude that we always want to be in control of what our usage is when it comes to mobile phones. And I'm sure that the day electricity tariffs are increased, helping the distribution companies in some sense, this will happen too. So to do demand response, the customer awareness is the problem that we started to investigate and get into. And while everybody said it is very challenging, our response has been very different. We have close to 125 customers right now in just 1.5 years of operation. And we are managing a load of close to 925 megawatts. Doesn't mean anything, 925 megawatts, because we can't do demand response. There's no regulation that would help us do that. But on the other side, when we go and talk to our customers and we tell them, if you are incentivized by maybe 2 rupees or 3 rupees or 4 rupees, whatever, will you shift or curtail your load? And 95% of our customers have said yes. Then we went to the second stage, which is how much? And one of our customers said, give me 24 hours notice, I'll give you 80% of my load. So, which shows that people have the capability, customers have the capability to shift load. Customers understand the economics of reducing their consumption at the right time and helping them, getting better margins in their product. It's just that the entire ecosystem is not complete. And I think that, like Gopal sir said, over time, with the entire feedback mechanism, it would be possible. So that's me.
Thank you. It seems I forgot to introduce myself. So I'm Bridgit Hartland Johnson. I'm a business consultant, and I'm also, for those that don't know me, a part-time lecturer at Great Lakes. So, and I'm the moderator for this panel. So we have to answer the question which was presented by by Pranav, which was on behalf of the students of Great Lakes, I believe. So he wanted to know how we can actually convert demand response into economic benefit. So my first question will be to you, Gopal. It's well known that BSES Rajdhani has a constant challenge in balancing the cost of purchasing power and what you can recover through tariff. So would you actually see that demand response could perhaps offer you a low-cost alternative to help perhaps reduce some of the cost of power purchase over the long term?
Bridgit, it's a valid question, but unfortunately, it doesn't give BSES any great help for the simple reason that most of our power procurement is through long-term power purchase agreements with utilities across India. I think Delhi gets about power from about 30 utilities right from east through to the west, north, not so much from the south. And since most of it is tied up through long-term power purchase agreements, my problem is to get rid of the surplus rather than to get the shortfalls. The second point, which is very much, and this is only true for Delhi, it's not so much true for other states, because in Delhi we have 24/7 power availability. Power is always available, it's never in short supply. The second part is that a demand response program would need the sanction of the regulators. In the current context where regulators are not willing to play around with these things, to get them to provide some benefits to a consumer at the expense of other consumers, I doubt it. I mean, we've been trying to get a demand response program going purely to be able to demonstrate it, and we still have not got the sanction of the Delhi regulators towards the same. So yes, in the context of the US, in the context of Australia, in the context of UK, Europe, where the entire scenario is different, you have spinning reserves, you have very strict regulations on load management, and as Anish said, you know, you don't shut off load whenever you feel that the peaking power is not there. In that scenario, yes, it will work. But I think the challenge in India is somewhat different, as Chintan and Anish and Vikram also said. So,
okay.
Can I just add to that?
Okay, yes.
I think picking the right place for demand response is very important, and I think that's what Gopal said. If you look at this situation in Delhi, where load is very predictable, you can fairly in advance predict it, and your supply base is very predictable because it's all long term. So the ability of demand response to deliver great results is possibly questionable, unless you get to a point where Delhi could have sold that power very effectively into the competitive market at peak times, and hence is getting it. But that's a fairly distant prospect. But if you take the other end of the country, in Tamil Nadu, where there's a lot of wind which is coming, and there is shortage in supply, there the context becomes very, very different. So through demand response, you are managing two things. One is that you are managing your peak and you are managing your net load at the peak times, but you are also managing variability in that net load through the times of the day. And often these problems are localized because the network in that region may not be able to handle beyond a certain amount of variability. So we should not look at demand response just as a pricing signal which will operate across the network in a state, but it's also a network management tool. And this is when we start looking at all the benefits in terms of peak load management, in terms of variability management, in terms of network management. I think that's where, and then finally having the customer participate in that whole process, that's where the true benefits of demand response will come out. I would strongly advocate that whenever we look at a demand response program, we don't look at states like Delhi which can't see the economic benefit of it, and rather focus on states like Tamil Nadu, Gujarat, because it has a lot of variable renewable energy, and maybe even Karnataka for these kinds of programs.
Okay.
Basically managing the day-to-day fluctuations in the demand and the supply. Probably in place like Delhi also, demand response could be an interesting option. Typically for the industrial customers who are the major consumer of power, if you really, why it is, it could be important because the number of consumers are going to be less. But then they are consuming nearly 80% of the power. May not be true in Delhi, maybe it is slightly different. But the point is, the industrial consumers are actually consuming a bulk of power. So it is easier to control them, or rather interact with them, and do this planning for demand response. So even in place like Delhi, it would have its importance. It's not just cost and availability of power, but then if you shift the peaks by simply interacting with the clients, and if you find it interesting and beneficial, then I think overall planning purpose and overall capacity additions and etc. it helps, because demand response has that one of the aspects. You plan your infrastructure for peak load. If you shift that peak, probably your infrastructure requirements come down. So that is another aspect that also cannot be ignored, even in place like Delhi. This is what we feel.
So I have a different perspective again. I think demand response is a tool to be future ready. It is not a tool to look at economics in a short term. Like the blackout happened, and if we were as a country ready for demand response, I think it could have helped by reducing the load. So for me, demand response is being ready for the future, and it can be called like any spinning reserve whenever needed. It cannot be run every day. Right? So the other thing is, most of the times what we do is we look at demand response as a cost. Our experience has been very different. So the entire demand response tool, or the electronics or communication part that has to be used, it is assumed that the distribution company would pay for it most of the times. But if there's a value in what we're giving to the customers are ready to pay for it. So I'm saying that the turnaround for the entire cash flow for the distribution company can be looked at. So there are various models, and for us, that's the bread and butter. So of course, I'm going to be on this side of the table.
I would just like to add, one of the prerequisites, as just heard, is that the entire ecosystem, including the regulatory environment, has to be also amenable to such changes. And from ISGF, that is India Smart Grid Forum, we are taking up with the regulators, both with the central level and also at the state level in certain cases, like Maharashtra, for example. So Maharashtra is one of the more forward-looking regulatory commissions, and they have already allowed, in fact, it is already implemented now. Tata Power has implemented a demand response program in their network, and close to, I think, more than 20 events have already taken place, and it works through an aggregator. And the model is that the aggregator pays to the large consumers something like maximum of about 2 rupees 25 paisa per unit, which is given off the grid by the high load consumers, like airports and other industries, or a large IT park or something. So they have had success, no doubt, about the working of the technology and the acceptance with respect to the consumer. However, to say that it is the answer for all the problems which a DISCOM is facing is, I think, not correct at all. It will definitely help, but the utility will be seen in the long run, and more and more such installations which come in place, and then what one learns from the experiences.
Okay, so I think it's obvious that there's no one hat fits all. There has to be different solutions for different problems, and probably different business models to deliver demand response in different situations. So recently I saw that the Ministry of Power has approved the roadmap for smart grids in India, and there is an element of that which focuses on demand response. I think it says by 2017, or in the next plan, there should be a rollout for AMI for all customers above 20 kilowatts, and mandatory demand response for all consumers above 1 megawatt. Now that's potentially going to have some implications for all of you. Well, may not have some implications, because I guess we don't have to implement it, but there's a thought, there's a reason behind that thought. So maybe, Anish, you could start and see what the perhaps institutional challenges, and perhaps what some of the solutions could be as well, to trying to filter down a national policy.
Yes. Well, I think we've touched upon it briefly, that we need the instruments of regulation to come in to make this policy effective. One is that you have these national goals, whether it's 2017 or 2019. 2017 is just another number. It has to make sense, then it's 2017. If it doesn't make sense, if it makes sense in 2019, it's 2019. That's not the issue of relevance. What is of relevance is creation of the ecosystem for making this happen, as we have been discussing, and regulation is an essential part of the ecosystem. So we need to have both the benefits and the costs balanced out in the right manner, and who's going to pay for it, the attribution of the costs is a subsequent issue. But one is to get to a robust mechanism of seeing what is the benefit versus what is the cost, and that framework is today missing, because we just take the hardware costs and say that we see only the infrastructure cost and the hardware cost. The quantification of benefits in a more comprehensive manner goes completely out of the window. So we don't understand what's the ROI for any such investment, and I think that's the first part. It links back to regulation, because the utilities costs per se are normally compensated by the regulator through the tariff process. So that's why it is important that the regulator understands that. The second is that it has to have benefits for the customer, because all of this cannot be a utility-driven system. It has to be something which gives tangible benefits for the customer along with tangible benefits for the system. We must remember that through smart grids we are doing something which the electricity system has not done in the past, which is intrude heavily into the consumer's domain. Okay, till then it used to be at the meter, we left the customer to do what they would want. But now we are talking of everything which intrudes into the customer's domain. So there needs to be enough payoff for the customer. The instruments of regulation for making all of this happen also includes tariff. And I think we need to get to a system where we are talking of dynamic pricing, critical load pricing, critical power pricing. All of these instruments need to be evolved, and they need to be evolved in a manner which is not the typical time of day pricing, which was much more rigid. We need much more flexible instruments of pricing. So all of these are essential ingredients which have to happen before we get to, I mean, these are just a sampling of things. There will be other things, including communications, infrastructure. So all of these things have to fall in place before we get into something where we can talk about those kind of, at this time, grandiose schemes for getting 1 megawatt and above into the demand response goal. But it's a laudable goal. It's something which, with communications coming in, with technology being demystified and becoming a part of our day-to-day life, all of these are become much more possible than in the past. So we have to work towards them. We need to see what kind of deadlines, but leaving the deadlines apart, I think creating the ecosystem is something which we all have to work towards.
Thank you. Vikram, anything about the technology implication of trying to meet this national roadmap? Any thoughts?
See, technology is always follows the demands from customers, whether it is a utility or an end customer. There are some core technologies which are already available, like say communication, like IT processing, software development, and of course what is really needed is to make sure that all these work together in the way they are expected to, and with respect to the performance what is there. So while these core technologies work, let me say a little bit of silos, but the challenge for technology providers is to bring them together, converge them to a really application which is meant for specific uses, specific applications, and that is where a lot of experience, a lot of hard work is put in so that we deliver this the right product for, because something which is there for say America may not work for Indian utilities or Indian consumers. Something which is there maybe for China also may not work. So we have to find what is the right requirement for here, and the features are put in, whether it is software or whether it is hardware, communication, everything must work in the Indian conditions. So that is a big challenge, and it is addressed accordingly.
Okay, thanks. Girish, anything else on technology or business processes?
No, I would say technology, yes, I mean it's a challenge, but it's not a major challenge, because technology has always caught up with the demands. And we have the technology, probably as Vikram said, in silos, but then I think we have enough experience of developing technology specifically for Indian conditions. So I don't see that is a absolutely major challenge. The major challenge is creating the ecosystem, creating the regulatory framework. Just now we saw that the utilities should find this demand response attractive. That is the first prerequisite. If that doesn't happen, then it will not be taken up. so it will not be taken to the customers. So that is an important thing. So how do we make it that the utilities find it attractive? That's an important part, and that can happen only with regulatory changes, market forces have to change. If that happens, technology and everything else will fall in place. Then you can talk of, how to make the business case for customers, how to make the business case for this particular initiative itself. Those issues will fall in place. I don't see big challenge in that, because conceptually everybody knows that demand response is a viable proposition. It's only how to make it applicable. That's the critical part, and that is where the ecosystem development, and that's what is going to be critical.
So Gopal, you're fighting every day to keep the lights on. How do you feel about these roadmaps? And
no, I think as Anish mentioned, a very laudable objective. But let me state that for any level of technology that exists in the ecosystem, grids have always been smart. I mean, in 1990s, how did you operate grids? You had a telephone call and you would have a man sitting over there, and you would have somebody doing something or the other on the OCBs or the relays or some such thing so as to ensure power availability. But the technological developments in associated fields like internet, like communications, have opened up a whole range of smart initiatives which can then be programmed into the way we look at distributing power. Take for instance BSES. All our meters are smart meters. I can read the usage patterns, I can read how a person is using that, and we are making it smarter. Along with Chintan, we are working out a program where I can get the data real time. The fact is that technologically I will still be capable, but then there need to be other developments in the sector which will enable this whole smartness to be translated into something of worthwhile nature to the consumers. Today there is no, I am glad somebody asked this question of Mr. Mayaram. There is no real-time power market existing in this country. The exchange is a day-ahead market, which means that I can only buy or sell power 1 day ahead of. The UI mechanism is no longer a mechanism through which the flow of power from surplus to deficient areas can take place. Bands have been tightened without tightening the penalties. So if you are tightening the bands on grid usage without making it mandatory for 24/7 availability, what is the point? I think this whole thing needs to be looked at holistically. I think demand response is just one of the areas which will help in providing a better quality of power to the consumers, whilst enabling a utility to be able to manage its peak. But there are possibly 99 other more important pressing matters which we need to look at.
So probably it is like maturity of the utility operations. So at what point of maturity of utility operations you would like to introduce demand response? There is also one important point probably need to look at.
Okay, and Chintan, you're close to the ground with your consumers, so what's their appetite for participating in these programs to support utilities?
So I come from Gujarat, and
Make some
you go and ask a Gujarati customer or a consumer, power consumer, and say that, will you reduce your consumption by X% if I give you 5 rupees? Of course, yes. There's no doubt about it, provided the entire process is not hindered. And I'm saying this is not a Gujarati trait. This is a business trait, right? If you can make money or reduce costs by not hampering your core business, I'm sure all our consumers or distribution consumers would be ready to shift. Again, I think it's more of educating them, which is an issue. There is no communication between the distribution company and its consumer for all practical purposes, except for the electricity bill that you get. I think that needs to increase, and that can increase only with technology. And as that increases, I think everything else will fall in place. That's on one side. Of course, the regulator needs to be online as well on the other side. But I think my bigger thing is that I don't know if anyone has ever made a business case for demand response for India. And what does it benefit? We're talking about demand response. As a country, does it make sense in the first place or not, is the question that needs to be asked.
Perhaps that could be a nice project for
Absolutely,
some of the students.
And I think the regulators need to be educated on this before the consumer. And I think that is the key to the entire ecosystem.
I can just share that there is a technical committee of regulators which is being set up, which will then report into the forum of regulators for evolving the regulations on smart grids, which a big part of it is demand response.
Okay.
Yeah, if I could just interpose here for a moment. I mean, many of you through your academic curriculum would be aware that the power sector in India is a concurrent subject. When I say that, I mean that distribution and transmission, the central transmission is a federal government prerogative. Sorry, generation and central transmission is a central government prerogative.
No,
while
generation is also in state.
yeah, I am just coming to that.
Right.
Central transmission, I said. While state transmission and distribution rests with the state governments. There is a central regulator, CERC, which looks after the central transmission and central generation facilities, and there are various state regulators that look after the state transmission and distribution sectors and also some of the state generation utilities. Now, in that sense, the power sector in India actually can be looked at as being an elephant. The problem that faces the power sector in India is that the central regulators and the government of India, if I may say so, have worked assiduously to making these central generation and central transmission utilities healthy, strong and vibrant, and that's a great thing. The body of the elephant is growing. The state regulators, the state political parties have, on the other hand, denied distribution utilities, state electricity boards, state transmission utilities with necessary funding, as a result of which the legs of the elephant have gone totally weak. So you know what happens when the body is bloated and the legs are weak, something falls. I think that's where we are currently, and that's possibly brought out by the fact that the state distribution utilities, the state electricity boards as they are called, are running with a staggering loss of 200,000 crores, roughly 2% of our GDP, and at least 400,000 crores, or roughly 4% of our GDP is stuck in power sector debt. And if this whole thing were to collapse, we are already witnessing a shakedown in the Indian stock markets. we would have a greater fallout than what happened in 2008 at the time when there was this huge shakedown in America. So, one of the foremost things is for government to look at this whole sector in a balanced perspective and to take steps to make it grow stronger, not just the body, but the entire. Today what is happening is that this, whatever is the profit in the central generation stations and transmission utilities is being fed through the losses of the state electricity boards and the state distribution utilities. The money is within that system only, within that ecosystem. There is nothing coming in from outside. And that's the greater challenge.
We'll finish with this, this panel discussion now, but it seems the message is clear that it is a viable tool that utilities can use to perhaps help with some of their issues, but we need to find the right model to go into the right, or the right shape to go into the right hole. And we need to do a lot with regulation, business models and things like that to make it continue in a much more efficient way. So with that, can I open up the floor to some questions from students, please?